Today on the show, I have the pleasure of speaking with Bushy Martin. Bushy is one of Australia's leading real estate investing experts. His company, KH Group, helps busy Australians invest in real estate to set themselves up for a comfortable retirement. Bushy is also the author of The Freedom Formula, Live More, Work Less, and Leave a Legacy with Property, which was launched earlier this year. In the book, Bushy explains the 6P's to creating the right mindset for property investing to unlock your financial goals with a long-term focus. I'm really pumped and excited to have him on the show, but enough out of me. Let's get him out here. G'day, Bushy. Welcome to the show. How you doing today, mate?
Fantastic, Reid. Real pleasure to be here, mate. And talking to a fellow Aussie in the US, really looking forward to comparing some notes, mate.
Mate, I heard you on a pretty awesome podcast a couple of weeks back, and I said, I've got to get this guy on my show. Just your charisma and your story was really, really inspiring. But for those people who don't know the Bushy Martin story, do you want to rewind the clock back and let's start all the way back when you were a kid? And, you know, how did you make your first ever dollar, as the Dent podcast likes to say?
Yeah, that's a good place to start, actually, mate. I'm country boy, and hence the term bushy. And as a kid, we moved around a lot in regional Australia. So I got used to meeting new people continuously. I think by the age of 40, I've lived in 40 different places, Reid. So I enjoy the cut and thrust of that. But as a kid, I was a punk-chested asthmatic. So I spent a lot of time in bed. In fact, in several places, 4 days out of 7, I was confined to bed. And my way of getting around was to always have a pen in my hand. So I was always drawing, designing, but the old man, given the country guy that he was, said, look, son, stop pussing around with those pretty pictures. Don't think you're ever going to make a living doing that. You've got to get out there and get a real job. So the old brain started ticking, Reid, and I thought, well, how can I combine my love of drawing and whatnot with something that Dad would consider to be a real job, and hence become an architect. So architecture was the real driver right from a very early age. I mean, I'm one of those nerds that if you asked me in primary school, what are you going to be? I would have said, yeah, I'm going to be an architect. And, which is pretty scary, mate, because I think you're an engineer. So there's right. Always that healthy antagonism between architects and engineers, mate. And in the Australian context, architect's normally not mentioned on its own. It's normally effing architect, because that's pretty much how most people perceive architects in Australia. But my first dollar, mate, I'm sort of meandering here a bit. My very first dollar was earned selling stickers, would you believe? It sounds bizarre, but in good old a little town called Bordertown in the southeast of South Australia, where we spent a few years, we started this sticker club. And we used to go around to the pubs and get all of the great big stickers that the pubs would put on the windows, and we'd get the tobacco company stickers, and we'd get the Coca-Cola, and it became, we created this quite intimate club, and we actually started making our own stickers in the finish, and then we created a sticker trading group at school. Wow. Now I'm talking, this is in primary school, where we got people to buy. Race off and source them. I'd ring the companies and I'd send the letters and say, can you send me your stickers? And all the kids at school wanted to get the latest Coca-Cola sticker or the you name it. So that was the first dollar. But alongside that, we had a second-hand golf ball business where myself and my brothers would spend time on the weekends in the creeks at the golf course in our rubber boots, retrieving lost golf balls and then selling them back to the golfers at the golf shop for a couple of dollars. So that was pretty much our first venture into the dollar-making exercise, mate.
Mate, that's an incredible stickers and golf balls, I should say, trudging around in the mud to make a dollar. That's pretty awesome. And I've heard a little bit about your story, but you mentioned, the name Bushy. It's an interesting name. It is your real name, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. My actually christened as John, but no one other than my mother, God bless her, who's now passed away, and my wife, when she's irate, uses the name John. They were so it's Bushy, and it's really a legacy for my old man, Reed. He was the original Bushy,
Yep.
and was very well renowned in Victoria and South Australia in particular, and had a lot of time for my old man. He was a real role model for me. So when he passed away, I just dropped the Bushy Junior tag, because everyone used to call me Bushy Junior. And out of respect for Dad, I just want to keep his legacy alive, mate. So every time someone calls me Bushy, in the back of my brain, it's reminding me of Dad. So it's that's
awesome.
Pretty much the backstory.
That's awesome. And for those people listening, Bushy, the bush, the outback in Australia, that's where you grew up, mate, isn't it? And that's where you cut your teeth on selling golf balls to unsuspecting golfers who was just selling them back their golf balls, which is pretty bloody awesome. But mate, walk me through the journey, because I know I was reading on your website before we jumped on here, and a little bit in the green room we were talking about just the aha moment. I think I was reading on your website about how you're an architect, and for those people who don't know, architecture is a bloody slog, like structural engineering, but architects tend to love to work and get in at 11 o'clock in the morning with a frappuccino and sort of a turtleneck on and leave at midnight, right? But tell me that story, because I was really interested to hear about that, because a lot of people who listen to the shows do work full time and they get to that burnout stage. So walk me through that.
Yeah, well, I guess like a lot of people in the Western world, mate, I was following the normal career model, and that was work hard at school, go hard at uni, get a good job, climb the corporate ladder, put some money into super, pay off your home loan, and then retire on that and tick off the bucket list when you stop work. That was pretty much the model, and that was pretty much the model my old man had been following at the same time. But because of a couple of things, I guess, Reed, that wasn't working for me for several reasons. And I mentioned before that as a punk-chested asthmatic, my way of coping with things in the early days, and because we moved around a fair bit, I was normally at least 1 and more often 2 years younger than everyone else in the class than I was. So I was a couple of feet below them. My way of coping with that was to work twice as hard as everyone else. And that was okay. The downside of it, but it's a two-edged sword, because the downside of that is that once I started achieving really good results with that, it became a self-fulfilling exercise where I just worked harder and harder, and I became a victim of my own expectations, in that if I achieved really good results, then I had to keep achieving good results. So I had to keep pushing and pushing, and became obsessive about that. And architecture can be a very obsessive career, because as you've well pointed out already, I was working 7 days a week, 14 hours a day. So very little gratitude, really. No one really respects architects in Australia in particular. Everyone thinks they are one, actually, because it's, how can you charge me that for knocking up something I could do on a serviette on the weekend, pretty much. So where that got to was burnout. I hit the wall, deserved to. I was absentee Reed, and that was a big shock to the system for me, because I was one of those country boys who was, marry once and marry for life. And at the same time, my old man's health started to pack up. So I've been following in his footsteps in terms of that work ethic and really going hard. And Dad was always going to work hard, retire, and then live the bucket list. He got bowel cancer, he had a whole series of strokes. It happened about the same time as my marriage went belly up, and I'll never forget the day, mate. He's sitting there dribbling out of the side of his mouth in bed, and he looked me straight in the eye and he said, "Son, learn from me. Don't do what I've done. Stop working for money and start getting your money to work for you." And that really pulled me up in my tracks, Reed, but at the right time, because I'd just come to grief myself in relation to following that typical model. And I then started hunting. So how am I going to do this? And like many others, I had my Kiyosaki moment. Where,
hey, mate. Love the old Kiyosaki.
Absolutely. He happened at the time running a session. So I thought, I'll go along and have a listen to this. And a mate of mine said, you've got to go and have a listen to this guy. He's really going to change your thinking. And that was light bulb, mate. It was passive income, of course. How come I hadn't thought of that before?
Easy, right?
Yeah, that's that easy. Yeah, it looked really easy in the book. And that really triggered the thinking process. So we did a number of things. So property was an obvious one for us. One, because I'd got my hands dirty with property in the architectural sphere anyway. So it wasn't scary for me in that regard. But I've got to say that I made a heap of mistakes early on. And my new wife, Sonia, and I are now trading 20 years together. One good thing about being an architect, Reed, is that you spend your whole life designing the future.
Mm-hmm.
So you're always starting with imagining what something's going to be and then breaking it down into the steps that we need to take to get us from where we are to realise that vision. And because that was second nature to me, when Sonia and I got together, the first thing we did was say, okay, how do we want to live? What's our perfect lifestyle look like? And we broke it down to what's our perfect day, week, month, year. What are we doing? Where are we doing it? How are we doing it? Who are we with? We got absolutely crystal clear on that. And then it was pretty easy for us to work out how much that lifestyle cost. Because what I was avoiding was what my old man was doing. He was just chasing the dollar for the sake of the dollar. He worked really hard and he did really well, but he killed himself in the process effectively.
Right.
So for us, it was about, okay, let's define what our perfect lifestyle is and then monetize that to work out what that lifestyle costs. All we need to then do is invest in assets that are going to produce that income stream and the job's done. That's it. So we embarked on that journey. We got stuck into property. As I said, I reckon I made every mistake you can make in property early on because I was focused on the property, not the process and the structure and everything else that goes around it. And what I help people now with is recognising that property is the vehicle, but it's almost at the end of the journey in relation to getting everything else in place before you actually go out and secure the property that's going to help you achieve your end. So that process brought us to what I call the freedom numbers in relation to work out what your lifestyle income needs to be to suit your perfect lifestyle. Then look at what your break-free number is. So how many years before you want to be in a position where you don't have to work? And I'm not saying stop work, but because most of us don't, we enjoy it, but not have to work. That's then very easily translated into the nest egg number. So in Australia, and I'm not sure what the numbers look like in the US, Reed, but if you average a 5% net return on whatever you invest in, and let's say that $100,000 in Aussie dollars is enough to give you a reasonable income, then at 5% times that number by 20, and there's $2 million worth in income producing assets that you need to have. And then the timeline will, the growth rate will then help you to understand what you need to be doing today. So if I had 20 years to accumulate the 2 million, and average growth rates in Australia, that's about 2 to 3 properties.
Right.
So no rocket science in it, not very difficult, not sexy, and very boring, but as a wealth by stealth process for most people who actually enjoy their careers and want to put their energy into career, driving their income and spending free time with friends and family, it's a model that works very well here in Australia.
No, it's an interesting thing. Sorry to cut you off there, but it's a very interesting model because when I first picked up the book Rich Dad Poor Dad, I was going to all the they call them RIA events here, but I was going to the RIA events in Australia, and all the things that you could do in Aussie. I think it was lease options, and I think they banned that pretty quickly, flipping houses. But it's interesting. Are you investing for cash flow in Aussie at the moment? Is that a thing? Because I've been in the States for so long and I've made all my investing choices here. And someone says to me, how do you make money in Australia? And I said, well, I don't actually know. I've been away for so long. So what is cash flow, your 5%? Is that typically your rule that you're trying to look for assets in Aussie?
No, let me describe that. So early on, it's all about affordable growth. So it took me a while to learn this here in Australia, Reed, but after some trial and error, and in assembling myself with a really good elite independent team is probably the best thing we've ever done. So a really good accountant who invests in property, a financial planner to look at the transition to retirement strategy at the other end, a really good project manager who's expert in putting the whole build process together, a good buyer's agent to identify the opportunities in the first place, and one of the absolute key players that no one spends enough time thinking about is a property manager. Because a really good property manager at the beginning of the process to help you know what sort of property works in a particular location, but then also to manage that property to remove any of the headaches, so you're not creating yourself a second job at the end of the process is also pretty key. But very simply, and I talk about this in my book, The Freedom Formula, if your nest egg isn't at the size it needs to be, then you need to invest for growth. It needs to be affordable, so you need to structure it in such a way that you're using all the tax incentives and all the benefits that the Australian government offers you to make sure that it's affordable, so it's not burning a massive hole in your pocket every week by holding onto the property, but growth is the absolute focus. When that portfolio reaches a stage where it's achieved that nest egg level, then it's converted to cash flow. So this strategy isn't one where you buy the properties and then end up living off the rent. This is a strategy where you grow your wealth through the property and then you transform that by eliminating debt, doing a rationalisation, converting some into index funds, some into cash, some into retaining properties, potentially moving types of property. So go into commercial property, which is much more cash flow orientated. Mm-hmm. So the very simple maths I talk about is go for growth and then convert to cash flow.
Okay.
So it's not a static exercise. It's a transition model that takes you to get to where you need to be income-wise, and then you convert that portfolio into a tax-effective income stream at the time you then start to work.
No, it's very interesting that a lot. I try to, when I explain to people what the Australian property market's like, I really try and I break it down into what they call tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 markets here in the United States. And you've invested here in the US, but something like, Los Angeles and New York and San Francisco, they're sort of your Australia-esque type of sub-markets where, property prices are through the roof, rent is high, but you don't cash flow because the property prices are too bloody high. Cap rates are in the toilet, they're less than 2%. So that's the type of environment you're investing in for the future. So maybe walk through some of the numbers that the average person earning that $100,000 a year would need to get to that point of this nest egg and financial freedom and the freedom number.
Yeah, so it is the property cycle in Australia on average, to be safe, and I'm a very conservative investor, Reid, to protect yourself, you need to be going through a 15-year journey. Now, the property cycle here will oscillate every 8 to 15 years. So, you hear a lot of spruikers in Australia talk about, the property doubles every 10 years. Well, sometimes that does, but a lot of the time that doesn't. 15 years, you will achieve that. So if we're going through a 15-year curve and we're averaging the sort of capital growth that you can get in the right locations, and this is the key, is being very careful about where you buy the property. The location is more important than the property itself, actually, in terms of growth. And there's some pretty simple things that we use to identify those properties, but we're trying to aim at an 8 to 11% growth rate over that 15-year period. That's a sort of an average exercise, and those opportunities are available, but you've got to be quite careful about where you do that.
Now, is that 8 to 11% year on year?
Yes, that's the average over that period.
That's
and
incredible.
If you look at, I did some research in the book, Reid, to look at the average growth of shares and property since 1924, and looked at ABS numbers and some other sort of respectable research houses. The average growth for those assets over that time, obviously, is between 11 and 11.5%. So they're big numbers,
it's huge.
but it's very very localised, Reed, very localised. So the art form here is identifying those locations that are going to give you that growth. And we've developed a fairly sophisticated means of actually getting confidence around what that is. But the simple things that we follow broadly, follow the jobs. That's the really simple maths. If you follow the jobs, everything else comes in behind it. So what we're trying to identify is strong income profiles that are growing. So it's generally looking at where are the professionals putting themselves, and then following their career growth. Because what happens here in Australia, and I'm less confident around this in the States, is that in tightly held locations, which are generally within the sort of up to 20k radius of the CBDs in Australia, if you identify areas where the professionals are living in and where the good school catchment zones are, because people will move their families into a school catchment zone just to get their kids at the right college or right school, then you've got an area where there's limited supply, strong demand, you've got a strong income which can afford to pay more for the property and keep paying more for the property as time goes on. So the employment and economic demographics are pretty key. And then from there, what adds to that is committed government infrastructure. So we're looking for change. You know, any real estate growth needs to identify what's going to be happening in the future in a particular location. I couldn't care less what's happened in the past. The past is a distraction, and way too many property investors use the rear vision mirror rather than a telescope, Reed. And
Agreed.
so we spent a lot of time identifying good research sources that are giving us forward trajectories on what's going to happen in a particular market. And gentrification and infrastructure growth are two key supporting drivers. So if we know that a rail extension or a new freeway or a new school or a new hospital or a new shopping centre is going to, then we start looking very closely at that if those other job and employment demographics start to stack up. And then the obvious thing behind that is that we tend to focus on highly owner-occupied areas where the property market's driven by emotion, not by investors. So you want to slipstream in behind that and then just set it up the right way so it's not taking any money out of your pocket. And it's possible in Australia on a new build property, because of such strong incentives around stamp duty concessions and depreciation incentives, to cash flow positive a new build property that will give you significant equity growth over that 15-year period that I'm talking about.
No, that's an incredible summary, and all that you've said applies. You know, one thing I've learned about investing abroad, being from Australia, living in London, I've lived in Europe, I haven't lived in Canada, but I've got mates in Canada who invest. It's the same stuff. It's job growth, it's GDP growth, which is the same thing as job growth. You want to look at. I love what you said about being around good schools, but transport-orientated developments, so rail, infrastructure, shopping malls, hospitals, stuff like that, where the job's creating, and then high owner-occupied suburbs. And that's again is another really, really key asset. And I completely, again, I don't care where you're investing around the world, those are key, just basics to investing in real estate. And you know, as I said, whether in Australia or here in the States or in Europe, those 4 or 5 keys are going to unlock, you know, financial freedom or set you on a path towards it. And then I think the big thing that I'm already hearing from you is just the long-term mindset, which a lot of people are just too busy. Like I want it to happen, you know, yesterday, right? So, okay, so we've got those bits right. Now let's talk about so you talk about the market, and that's very specific. And could you give me an example, maybe just before we go on to the next topic, of where in Australia something that I could then maybe relate it back to the American market, just because I know Australia so well, I guess. Like what sort of suburbs are you looking at? You're looking around Melbourne, you're looking around Sydney, Adelaide, Brisbane, Perth?
Yeah, okay, that's really good. So we have a really good look at what's happening on the property cycle for each of those areas, and they're not synchronised. So each area is going through its own, and the market here in Australia, Reed, and because I'm not sure how it operates in the US. It's not a nice, beautiful exponential curve. it's an S curve really. So what we tend to see is you'll get 4 or 5 years of very strong growth that comes around that change, and then quite often you'll see the markets actually come back 5 or 10% and then go flatline for up to 8 years, and then it'll spike again, and then it'll flatten and spike. So this spike and plateau routine really helps us to look at where do we need to be identifying locations based on their positioning on that curve. So in the current marketplace in Australia, the places you wouldn't touch with a 40-foot pole because they've just been through massive growth are Sydney and Melbourne. Hobart has just had an overflow from tree changes and sea changes that see that as a cheap location compared to what's happened in Sydney and Melbourne, where they've had exponential equity growth and they've got money to burn. The two areas that we are focusing on at the moment are in those tightly held suburbs in and around Brisbane, but also in the eastern sector of Adelaide. What part of Oz were you from, mate?
Mate, I'm from the sunny coast, and I went to school in Queensland, in Brisbane. So I know probably exactly where you're going to be investing, because that's against where I went to my first ever REIA event. Was called the Brisbane Property Network. I think I still get their emails, but that's where I first cut my teeth. So where in Brizzy are you? Because what I might say is, before we dive into that, is that you're identifying growth and historical data. So yes, you are looking back in the rear view vision mirror to make sure you're seeing where you are on that curve, but identifying what the curve is. I think that's really important, right? Because if you don't identify what the growth is in the market and when it's stagnant, when it's not, historically, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot, because, as they say, it's best to plant a tree 20 years ago. The next best time is right now. It's the same with real estate investing, but don't be an idiot. and as you're so rightly put it, the Australian property market, like the US, when people say on all these, Fox News and all these bloody stuff, there's all the Aussie housing market, or the American housing market. In the United States, we have 400 metropolitan statistical areas, and within those 400 MSAs, there's sub-markets and streets and north, south, east, west. And Aussie has exactly the same thing, in which we're about to get into. But so I just wanted to make that point clear that, again, we're trying to tie the similarities between the two countries, because it's very important to understand that the takeaway here is it doesn't change, right? You're still doing the same principles regardless of where you're investing around the world. So I'll leave that be, but to take it back off where you're investing in Brisbane. So you're looking at Hobart and Brisbane, but you're looking at also the S curve on where they are in the growth market, a growth cycle. Yeah,
sorry, I should qualify that. Not to Hobart. Hobart, I invest in. No, it's the two locations, the three locations that are projected to do well over the next 3 years, and that's about as far forward as you can look, given the information we've got. And we've got access to some really good research now that is looking at forward projecting reports. There's a group called Riskwise that's come into the market here in Australia that's producing really easy to comprehend reports using algorithms that are looking at all of the key criteria that we've spoken about. But let's take Brisbane, for example. And one thing I should say is that one thing that we do with investors first up is we determine what is their affordable spend. So what's their purchase price power? We need to establish that before we even start looking at property. And then based on that purchase point, find the highest growth location at that price that's going to give them the sort of results that they're looking for. So when someone comes to me and says, where's hot? And I say, well, how much you got to spend? Because that will determine where you really start to look. And in really simple terms, and it's not quite as simple as this, but the less you've got to spend, the further you are from the CBD. That's the general mass of it. So if you're spending, say, $450 to $550, and we're looking at southeast Queensland, which is the area then there are pockets in the sunny coast that I would look at. There's pockets in and around the Ipswich area, and you're probably going, oh, Ipswich, that's that housing trust tragedy. There's an amazing amount of government infrastructure being put into identifying that location as a second CBD for southern Queensland.
Yep.
So there's massive infrastructure, highways, rail, education hubs, IT employment hubs that are all going down to that location. So if you're spending $450 to $550, we're also generally big fans of real houses for real people, Reed, because in terms of being a conservative investor, we're looking at where do most Australians like to live. Now, most Australians don't like to live in units, townhouses and apartments. The only people that generally do are singles, divorcees and first-time investors who think it's cheap. And that tends to cap its growth. At the higher end, you tend to fall out because there's less buyers. But if you're in that sweet spot for a 3 or 4 bedroom, double bath, double living, double garage home in Australia, which is the Australian model, on a maintainable block of land, it's always going to rent and it's always going to sell. So we tend to focus on those and finding infill blocks in an area that's regentrifying, where we can build below market value. So you're getting instant equity uptake on completion.
Okay, so you're building brand new, is that right?
Yeah, so if you're spending a bit more, and the reason we go brand new, and it's even been more emphasised with recent changes to the legislation here in Australia over the last couple of years, the government has pulled the wings off depreciation on existing properties. And the reason the government's doing that here is they know we've got a massive housing shortage. So they're incentivising mum and dad investors to build new stock rather than buy existing.
Be careful, you might turn into the urban sprawl of America.
Oh, well, and that's a good point, but a lot of the work that's being done now is the regentrification of existing suburbs. So rather than that greenbelt sprawl on the fringes, which goes forever, it's more about, and I wouldn't touch those areas with a 40-foot pole because there's no scarcity. Where you've got buckets of land that just keeps hitting the market, then you're not going to do well there. But if you can get in and amongst an existing area where there's been some zoning changes that are promoting higher density, so it's houses but on smaller blocks, because the average Aussie doesn't want to spend their weekends mowing the lawn or weeding the garden anymore. We want to enjoy life. We can find those pockets. So if we're spending a bit more, so let's, again, in areas that will make sense to you, if we're spending anywhere between sort of 600 and 800,000, which is where most Aussies would cap out, when we're talking the Camp Hills and those sorts of areas in closer to the Brisbane CBD, which are tightly held, again, good schools, easy commutes, good quality properties with a rezoning that's promoting high density. It's those sorts of, and there's some areas similarly out east of the city on the way to the airport where there's a lot of new infrastructure, which are also looking pretty strong. So they're probably areas that ring bells in your head.
No, they do. And just for those people who are listening, it would be the equivalent, so Ipswich would be the equivalent of the Inland Empire to Los Angeles. And your Camp Hill would probably be your Crenshaw area. And if you're looking in the LA market, which is very specific, but around the Inglewood where they're building the stadium, stuff like that, infrastructure's coming. We're actually looking in and around that price range, and some of the stuff we're looking at for $600,000 to $750,000 in LA is very much a ghetto. So it's even for us buying here in LA, again, that's why it's so much similarity between markets like LA, San Francisco, New York to Brisbane, Melbourne, Adelaide, stuff like that. There's just so many similarities. So again, and being transport orientated development focused is very important, but continue. So you're in and around the 500 to 600, 700,000 range, but you got it. But the key is you got to be able to afford it, right? Because the rent will the rent that you bring in cover the mortgage in that case? Okay, there we go. Okay, but keep going.
So this is where the art form comes in, because if you're going on a 15-year investment journey, it's got to be affordable. So a lot of the work we do early with people, before we've even started to canvass property opportunities,
right?
Once we've established what someone can afford to purchase at a price point, then we've got some sophisticated software that enables us to look at how much per week will this particular price point cost you based on every conceivable cost involved in securing, building and holding that property in year 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 15. So that, and then overlay that with what's going to be happening in their lifestyles over that time. So are they sending their kids to private school? What impact is that going to have? Now, it's fairly easy given the incentives I've already spoken about with depreciation and stamp duty concessions on new builds, to have a negatively geared property that ends up being positive cash flow. And when I say positive...
explain negatively geared for those people who don't know what that is.
Yeah, so negatively geared very simply is where the property is pulling money out of your pocket every week. That's about as simple as that I could explain it.
Yep.
So you're holding onto this property and it's costing you something while you hold it. Because we've got those tax incentives here now in this country, and they're pretty good for new builds, and hence the reason why we're supporting new builds, we're using the negative gearing benefits, so all the tax depreciation benefits that are keeping somewhere between 10 and 20 grand a year in your pocket rather than giving it to the tax man.
Mm-hmm.
That, by pouring that back in and then doing some tricks around, there's some tricks that we use to, rather than wait for the end of the year to get a great big tax lump back, we do a tax variation with the Australian Tax Office to make sure we're getting an increment of that back every week or every payday. Then let's smooth this cash flow so it becomes slightly positive cash flow, and then it's sustainable. So if it's not pulling anything out of your pocket, and I mean this is incorporating every cost involved in the property,
rehab,
suddenly it's having
repairs and maintenance and stuff like that.
All of that. So, and we allow 7% vacancy rate for the property every year. We're very conservative in those allowances to make sure that we're looking at worst case scenario. But if we can get someone in a position where even on a worst case conservative basis, it's effectively going to be positive cash flow, then that becomes sustainable forever, because it's not biting into salary, it's not biting into savings, it's not crimping lifestyle. And if it's managed properly, if you've got the right team behind you, you get on with focusing on your career and spending what limited time you have with friends and family while the property portfolio is doing its thing in parallel.
Got it. And so the key would be that once you got the first one off to the races, what's the number? Like, there's gurus around Aussie and in the States here, it's own 10 properties and you're financially free, or own 60 properties and you're financially free. What is it in Australia? Because at $500,000 each, mate, owning 10 properties is $5 million, and that's a lot of bloody money.
Well, this is a funny thing, Reid, and this is what makes me laugh when I hear all these spruikers carry on about 10 properties in 10 years and blah-de-blah-de-blah. Reality is, if your time frame is long enough, because this is where there's an expression I use when I talk to first-time investors, and that is that you've got to give yourself plenty of TLC. And what I mean by that is not tender loving care, although it is actually in a different format. It's using the time you have available, and the more time you've got, the easier this gets. It's using leveraging other people's money and other people's expertise, and then allowing the magic of compounding returns, which good old Albert Einstein referred to as the eighth wonder of the world, to do its work. So if you focus on TLC, then it becomes easy. And the first one, time, is the most important ingredient. And it's a bit like a ladder. If you've got 20 years, it's a nice gradual walk up a slope. If you've got 5 years, you're climbing Everest using Sherpas and hanging on for grim life as you try to climb the cliff. So if we've got 20 years, let's use 20 years. Let's use those freedom numbers I spoke about before, Reid. $100,000. If you reckon that's enough to live comfortably, I think that's a bit under for most people, but let's use 100 grand.
Round numbers, right? It's easy to do math.
Round numbers. Yeah, so there's your life. Yeah, spot on. There's the whole number. At 5%, that means we need $2 million worth of assets, but that's in 20 years' time. So if we trickle that back and cascade it to what does that mean today, it's about 600,000. So for most people, if they secure 2 or 3 properties structured the right way so it's affordable in high growth areas, that's job done.
There you go. Got it. Okay. So it's 2 or 3. Yep, that makes sense. And then that's over a long-term period. I think that's the key, but because so many investors are so focused on, there's actually been a bit of narrative around this in the States about when Wall Street, when the financial market does quarterly reporting, and should it be quarterly reporting instead of 6 monthly reporting? I think Europe does it every 6 months, but the short-term mindset of investors, I think to what you do in the Australian market, for those listeners who are, keen on the US market, there are ways of making great long-term wealth through high growth markets, even in the United States, which is very similar to what Bushy's just been talking about. So I just want to quickly talk about that. But having that long-term mindset rather than just looking at this every quarter and like, oh shit, what the fuck's it? Excuse my language. What's the NOI doing every bloody quarter? You're sweating over it. So no, that's incredible stuff, mate. I do want to be conscious of your time, but I definitely want to get into I want you to finish off what you're talking about that, because you 3 to 4 properties in 20 years time. So then I would assume that if I wanted to double that, $200,000 a year, I'd need 6, right? So you'd be looking.
It's not quite linear. It's not quite linear, mate.
Okay.
But, because of the impact of the compounding growth and the time factor.
Sure.
But it'd be 4 to 5 properties, yes.
4 to 5 properties in high growth markets that are around your sort of $500,000 to $600,000 entry point, if that's what you can afford. Can I ask?
Yeah.
What happens when you've got your first one under the belt? What are you doing to get the second one under the belt? Say, and is that, and when are you looking to inject that second one into the portfolio along the time span of 20 years?
Yeah, so the philosophy we normally use with the people we assist, mate, is that you invest every time you can. Simple as that. So if someone's got the horsepower to do it, and we normally won't do more than one at a time, particularly if they're going through the build for the first time, because it's a completely new experience, and they need to go through that and be comfortable with it before they're ready. Number 2. But normally we'd be suggesting, because time's so important here, and if I summed up the investment philosophy, Reid, it's use as little of your money to secure as big an asset base as you can, as quickly as you can, but make it as affordable as you can, and then just sit back and let time, the tenant, the tax man, and capital growth do the rest of the work.
Yep.
So if we boil that down, then depending on someone's capacity, so this comes back to looking at your income, looking at your assets, and looking at liabilities. What is your capacity to secure property? And that will determine how quickly you do them. If there is a limited capacity, and equity is often the deciding factor here, then normally we're adding the second property somewhere within 18 months to 2 years. And because we're using the equity that we've created in property 1, because if we've done this properly, we've created instant equity because we've built it below what its market value is. And if it's in the right sort of zone at the right time, you're getting some capital growth out of that. Then property 2 in 18 months to 3 years is we're adding property 2, and then another 18 months to 3 years, depending on a number of factors, we're adding property 3. And for most Aussies, 3 properties is enough to get you there.
That's incredible. And I think there's a statistic out there that if in the Aussie market, at least, I remember learning this at first back at the Brisbane Property Network. If you own 2 properties or more, I think you're in the top 5% in Australia or something like that. Is that still the statistic?
Absolutely right, mate. There's over 90% of investors only own 1 property. And here's a really interesting stat for me, mate. Over 50% of first-time investors sell a property in the first 5 years.
Wow. And
the reason for that is all they've done is focus on the property. They haven't structured it the right way. They haven't set up the finances the right way. It's, 18 months in, it's burning a massive hole in their pocket. It's starting to impact on lifestyle. It's putting pressure on their marriage because, shit, we can't afford this bloody thing. Whereas if they'd actually sat back and property was the last thing they did on this whole exercise and put everything else in place, then you could be amongst the 1%. There's about 1% that own 4 or more properties in Australia, mate, which is quite staggering, actually.
That is very staggering, actually. I didn't realize it was that. I didn't realize it was that low, but it gives you a perspective, right?
Yeah, I'm quite convinced that the reason there aren't more in that category are because they're just not setting it up the right way.
Okay. And so let's quickly summarize the setting up again, because I think that we sort of skimmed over that, but it's the same principles here. You've got really great tax benefits in the US for depreciation. We've got cost segregation here. I don't know if you call it something different in Australia. It's accelerated depreciation of existing things like, a washing machine won't have a lifespan of 30 years. It's going to have a lifespan of 5, so you can depreciate it over a shorter period of time. But you mentioned something about the tax that was key to flatlining it rather than lumping it at the end of 1 year. So we just want to quickly summarize that again.
Yeah, so in Australian terminology, it's called a PAYG withholding tax variation. That's the technical term. But what it means is how it actually operates. Let's say that you add a new build property and it's going to give you back 10 to 15 grand a year in tax. So rather than wait for the end of the year to get that great big lump in your hand and therefore have to carry the property for the rest of the year to get to that point, by employing that tax variation, that 10 or 15 grand divided, say you're paid fortnightly. So you divide that 10 or 15 grand by 26. That's how much extra you're going to end up in your pay packet every pay, which means that you've got the extra income there to smooth the cash flow. And the other real benefit of that in the Australian context is that part of what we help investors do is not only accumulate a portfolio that's going to replace their income long term, but we use all of those tax benefits to power down the elimination of their non-deductible home loan, so they're in freehold possession of their home years earlier. So if we're pumping all of that, the rental and the tax variations and all of the inflows into an offset account against their home loan, you can cut 10 to 15 years off that period and save tens of thousands of dollars in interest on the owner-occupied home loan position.
Right, that's an incredible, and I think you can do the similar things here in America. So again, most Western countries are. The thing I say about, I don't say, but a lot of people say, is that the tax code in most Western countries is really a book to owning, real estate, because the government is not in the business of owning real estate and providing housing for the citizens. So use it, think of it that way. It changes your mindset about how you approach taxes when you're owning real estate and the benefits of owning real estate and a hard asset versus a paper asset, which I'm sure you talk a lot about. But mate, yes. I want to quickly summarise the 6P's that you talk about.
Just hold on, mate. Hold on. Sorry, Reid. I've got So I just had a visitor there. I'm sorry to break the flow there, Reid.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Laura will get it. What I was going to get into, I wanted to quickly, end the program with talking about the mindset around the 6P's of what you do, and break that down a little bit for me before we wrap up the show.
Yeah, well, mindset. I mean, everyone talks about mindset, Reid. It doesn't matter who I talk to. It seems to be on the top of everyone's agenda. And mindset in the context of the property investment arena is really about getting your expectations right, because far too many property investors think it's going to be easy, that it's just buying a bunch of homes like the ones they live in. They don't anticipate there being any issues, so they haven't put the right risk management structure in place. And in the book, The Freedom Formula, I've tried to boil those mindset expectations down into the 6P's. And they are, firstly, purpose and belief. So you need to get crystal clear around why you're doing this. And if you're crystal clear around why you're doing it, and therefore you're selecting the right sort of property to suit that, then that purpose and belief is going to act as both a magnet and a compass. A magnet in terms of you'll stay the course over that 15 years because you know what the prize is going to be at the end. But in addition to that, it acts as a compass in that every opportunity that then comes across your table on a day-to-day basis, if it's not taking you closer to that, you say no. If it is, you say yes. So it acts as a bit of a guide in that regard. The second is perspective, which is your vision. So get really crystal clear on what that ideal lifestyle looks like, and then develop a roadmap that's going to get you from where you are to where you want to be, and how and what type of property that needs to assist you do that. So that's again, just planning it out so you know the steps to follow. The third is plan. So that is actually putting some shape around what that strategy, and I call it a strategy roadmap for the people we look at rather than a strategy, because it's getting people started on their journey to fulfill their future. So putting some real shape around that so that they know where they're at, and picking up on your point before, I talk about this in the book as well. There's no point having a 15-year strategy if you're going to re-look at it every 12 months and then make dumb decisions around selling or buying a property at that point in time. That's a folly. So definitely look at it 18 months to make sure that things, and you can tweak it, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, which a lot of people tend to do. The fourth one is being proactive. And the flip side of that is avoiding procrastination. I talk to way too many investors, and I was like this when I started too, Reed. I was looking for the perfect property, and the perfect property doesn't exist. And if it does, it gets sold the day before you want to buy it. So procrastination, you can analyse the property industry forever and always come up with a reason why you shouldn't be doing it. Because time is so important to the end result, the quicker you secure property, and I'm not saying going out and secure any old property, it's got to fit all the parameters, but do something. Be proactive and do something. It's again, no rocket science with that either. The fifth one is probability. And what I mean by probability is a nice word for risk. So make sure you bulletproof this thing before you start. So a bunch of stuff that we do, for example, just to give you some context around this, around risk, is that we'll build because we'll minimise the affordability cost, but we'll build in what I call a war chest rainy day reserve into the exercise to cover any eventuality. So we assume that you're going to need to survive for 6 months without getting an income from your job or an income from the property. And if we build a war chest using the equity you have, which you only pay for if you use, then you can sleep easy knowing that it doesn't matter what comes along, you're never going to be put in a financial position where you can't afford and then make dumb decisions. The other thing that we do very simply with the property portfolio is each and every property and the financing arrangements with it are standalone. Now, what I mean by that is that the banks, without telling you, and most brokers cross-securitise or cross-collateralise the properties, and without you knowing it, all of the loans are secured against all the properties.
Right.
Which means that your owner-occupied home is at risk if something goes wrong. And worse than that, it reduces your capacity because the banks buffer everything to cover their risk. And if you need to make a change to either sell your home or buy or sell another property, they always revalue everything. And if the market in particular locations are a little bit below, then all of a sudden you could be short on equity. So create a standalone structure and then bolt on offset accounts into each and every one of the loan facilities so that we're optimising the tax deductibility, but also effectively reducing debt over the journey. So there's a whole bunch of other things, but there's some fairly simple things that you can build in that give you that sleep at night factor so that you can rest easy knowing that when and if the issues occur, and they will occur. I say to people, property's not a smooth ride, it's a bumpy ride, but if we've made sure that the suspension on the car is going to absorb every shock that you come across and you're going to enjoy it, then you don't have to worry.
Right.
So that's what the probability risk aversion is about. And then the final one, which is the absolute key, mate, is patience and persistence. And the reason I emphasise that so much is that every one of us lives in the instant iPhone world, mate, where we're so used to having things happen immediately at our fingertips by the press of an app or the press of a button, that the concept of long-term and embracing time as your friend rather than the enemy just doesn't exist in our psyches anymore. So you used a really good example earlier on of if you plant a seed today, you don't get a tree tomorrow. You get a shady tree with fruit in 20 years' time. That's the law of nature, mate. And every area of growth where you're trying to achieve success, 15 to 20 years tends to be it.
Yep.
Every successful person I've researched, it doesn't matter whether it's property, shares, business, you name it, takes at least 20 years. Warren Buffett, he only really kicked off his wealth at age 55, mate, and most of that wealth has occurred in the last 20 or 30 years.
No, you're completely correct. It's incredible. Keep going. Sorry.
It is incredible. And awesome. So that patience and persistence thing is that in terms of mindset, that's the thing that I bang the drum on continuously about, is that accept that's going to take 15 years, embrace that, enjoy the time. Don't try and force to make it happen because it won't. You'll make mistakes if you start trying to second guess and force the exercise. But accept that you're going to be in a fantastic shape in 15 years plus time. Get out of the road, focus on what you're good at, and enjoy the journey.
I love it. Absolutely love it. And I want to add one thing that I personally see a lot of failures, and you would too, with that perspective. And if you have the wrong mindset going into something, I see a lot of people quitting. They quit on things. Like, as you said about those guys, they get 5 years in and oh crap, my marriage is falling apart because I haven't structured it correctly. But it's because of the mindset on the front end, right? We've got these gurus out there. You're going to get financial freedom in 3 to 5 years. But if you say, well, I'm going to get financial freedom in 10 years or 15 years, you're not going to quit when you get to 5. Because, you may not have achieved it at 5. So it's about that mindset going on, and that's the perspective. And I think that's really key to a lot of things around real estate, a lot of things around success, a lot of things we'll talk about on this podcast about being an entrepreneur and all those bloody good things. But the fact is, if you don't have the right mindset on the front end, you're going to set yourself up for failure, because when you do get to that point, you're like, crap, I haven't got financially free, or I haven't got X, Y, Z. I'm going to quit. I'm going to screw this. I'm going to go try something else. So I love it. Absolutely love it. But just to summarize, it's purpose, perspective, plan, proactive, probability, patience, and persistence. That's right?
No.
Perfect. Love it. Love it, mate. Mate, I want to be really conscious of your time. Where can people go to find out more about what you do, get in your sphere, get the book, just be all about, because I know you've got a podcast as well, so we want to give yourself a little bit of a plug.
Yeah, thank you. So the podcast is Get Invested, and I'm looking forward to interviewing you on Get Invested when we return from Europe mid-October, Reid. So that's going to be an awesome discussion more around the US market, which I'm looking forward to. The book is The Freedom Formula, and if you want to find that, you can jump on our website. So there's the KH Group website, so www.khgroup.com.au. I've also got the bushymartin.com.au website if you can't remember KH. They'll lead you to the same place effectively. They're the easiest place to get it. Or if you want to email me, I like to interact with people, and so does our team. It's bushy@khgroup.com.au, right? bushy@khgroup.com.au. Well, mate, I know we didn't get into the top 5 investing tips, but I think I could keep talking to you for the next 2 hours, mate. I don't want to rip you away from your day job, but mate, I want to thank you for getting on the show today. I just quickly want to summarize some of the incredible things we've spoken about. I think obviously the big one for me is just the time mentality around investing and allowing yourself a good long runway in order to set yourself up for success. I think it's really, really important. Just to in and around some of the interesting factors you use when you're sourcing your properties, because it's the same things and the same fundamentals that you look at any investment market, whether it's in Australia or in the United States, whether it's in Los Angeles or it's in Adelaide or it's in Texas or it's in New York. You're still looking for those fundamental things, which are, you want to look at infrastructure, you want to look at job growth, you want to look at GDP, and I think the other one was that you want to look at jobs, infrastructure, GDP. Oh yeah, and infrastructure related to transportation, hospitals and stuff like that. And then obviously to wrap it all up, the 6P's, which has been incredibly insightful into what you do. Did I leave anything out, mate? No, mate. That was absolutely spot on. I agree with you. We could talk for hours. I think what we might do, mate, because we're obviously got similar values, and it's quite rare to come across someone who actually shares a approach, is that this might be round 1. So
exactly. This is be round 1, listeners. There's going to be a series, a 3-part series. I think it could be.
Awesome, Reid. Really good talking to you, mate.
Mate, well, thank you so much. And remember, listeners, if you do want to jump on my website, you can make sure you check out all of Bushy's information up there. Check out links to his new book. And if you have any questions, please shoot him an email. Thanks again for taking some time out of your day to tune in to continue to grow your financial IQ, because that's what we're all about here on this show. And we're going to do it all again next week. So take care, be safe. Remember, happy investing.